Good morning. We'll be starting up in about 3 minutes. Good morning. We'll be starting up in about 2 minutes. About 1 more minute. We'll be starting up. So good morning and welcome to Topical Tuesday webinar here with the New York State LTAP program, our center, Cornell Local Roads program. I'm David Orr. I'm the director here. And today we're going to be talking about estimating and understanding the cost of highway projects. Now, just as a reminder for those who haven't been on one of these before or haven't been on in a while, this is a Zoom webinar. So if you have issues with sound or something, you click on the audio settings on the left. The chat pod has been disabled, but you may want to open the chat because that's where we put notes and information to you. So for instance, there is a handout, if you're interested, that just has some notes that you can either follow along or, more importantly, resources you might want to look at later on, including the spreadsheet that I'm going to show you towards the end of the hour. And you can download that by clicking, there's a link available in the chat pod. There is a raise hand feature. Again, this is all near the bottom of your screen. In fact, if you want to go ahead just to practice, go down near the bottom, you can raise your hand, and then I can see if you've raised your hand. And that can actually be useful. I may ask you some questions. So I got a few of you raised your hands. Okay, good. And then finally, the Q&A pod, and that's probably the one you might want to go ahead and open it up. That's where you put in your questions. We've got Amanda Link and Adam Howell sitting in the background watching and monitoring this on both Zoom and Facebook. And so if there are questions, they'll put those in there, or I'll try to monitor them myself and answer your questions. And I may ask you some questions, and that may be where you put in your answers as well. So that's just a rundown on the repairs for you and the way that we use Zoom. So in terms of repair options, before we get into the actual costing, there's an old saying in construction, there's 3 options: good, fast, and cheap, and you're allowed to pick any 2. Now, this isn't completely true. We know that, like all sayings, it's got a bit of a hyperbole to it. But it's not actually as far from the truth as we'd like to see. A lot of times, if we rush something, um, we tend to get cheap. That's the one we really don't want. We don't want cheap. But we can do things quickly, but sometimes they can be expensive. The goal is to make sure we don't do cheap. We do good and fast, and then we worry about cost as well. This is actually a tragic case that occurred in Asia, where they were putting in foundations. They didn't really put in deep enough borings. It was high water in that canal you see over on the right, and tragically, a couple of people lost their lives during construction when there was a failure because they really were trying to do things on the cheap. So think about that when you're doing any of the operations, and as we go through, we'll talk about those as well. Now, in terms of getting work done, uh, one of the things we need to be doing now, it's winter. It doesn't seem like work is something need to be thinking about, but now is the time to do that. Now is the time to actually get your projects built in your brain. And so what I like to do is actually do that, write down a list of what I'm going to try to get done. Doesn't mean I stay on schedule, but if I don't have a plan, I don't have a chance. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to determine the work that is needed. And we'll do this with a practice towards the end of the hour. You're going to plan those activities. You're going to write them out the steps. You're going to calculate the cost for each of those steps. And then finally, later on, once the weather breaks, you're going to go out and you're going to implement those activities. Now, the reason I like to do that is because I want to think the whole process through from beginning to end, all of the steps, including cleaning up at the end. And the reason is fairly simple. If you don't think of all the steps, you might miss something that's pretty important. This is a picture from London where some people were putting in security bollards near a building because, we have to think about that, sadly. So they wanted to put in security bollards so that you couldn't park a van loaded with something dangerous right next to the building. And they used a quickset cement when they did it. I hope some of you have figured out now they actually had to go in and chisel out one of their brand new bollards that they had put in to get their van out. So think all the steps through and be willing to change. You may have to change during the middle of your process, but part of cost calculations is knowing what the project is. Now, in terms of calculating the cost, it's really pretty easy once you have a plan. All you got to do is figure out for each item, each step, the material cost, the invoices or contractual expenses, your own labor, and your own equipment. And yes, that does stand for a sort of silly acronym, and I'll write it for you here. Oh, just change color on the blue part here. We'll do different color here. There we go. Yes, the acronym is pretty easy to remember. Okay, mile. If my touch screen will say hello. Come on, there you go, touch screen. Get the E there. Mile. And so that's actually pretty easy for us to remember. And it's actually a pretty cool calculation. And we'll show you an example of that during the later part of the hour. Now, when you're doing that, again, you need to think carefully about all the items and make sure you've got realistic cost and make sure you think of all the steps that are involved. Because if you miss something, you forget a little detail, it can come back to haunt you. Now, this happens to be more of a safety issue that happened. In this particular case, they were driving down an interstate at 70 miles an hour with a large backhoe, and they forgot to release the pressure in the hydraulics, and the backhoe began to slowly lift, and the driver didn't notice it and hit this bridge at 70 miles an hour. Amazingly, the bridge did not collapse. It's pretty impressive how strong structures are if they're designed well. Now, in terms of estimating the amount, whenever I'm doing a project, especially in the municipal sector, I actually like to use day size units. I like to calculate the cost for a given day. Now, in the Q&A pod, can somebody tell me why would I use day size units for my productivity if I'm trying to figure out how many tons of asphalt or how many miles of chip seal or how much guide rail I'm putting up during a day? Why would a day size unit be something I might like to look at doing? Again, put that in the Q&A pod, see if anybody has some ideas. It allows you to deal with weather. That actually is a good point. If you've calculated day size units, then you could sort of estimate, I lose a day due to weather here and there, and do an overall calculation by dealing with that. Keeps the numbers smaller, that rather than the whole project, they can break it down. Yeah, that's a good possibility. So I looked at the list. I see some of you work for at least a few I noticed that are from the state. I see some towns. I see one tribe and a bunch of counties. So you're all different sized agencies, but how long does it take to get from your shop to the farthest end of the municipality? Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, so for 5 minutes, not a big deal, but an hour, ooh, and now you're talking an hour. Okay, the reason I like to use day size units is mobilization. By using a day size unit, mobilization gets built in. Now, if you're doing, contractors love to calculate the mobilization cost because it matters to them because they may be driving 3 or 4 hours from their main facility. But for most municipal work, we sort of can figure out by just doing a day size unit what the costs are, and mobilization gets built in. But remember, that means you include the cost of the entire day for the crew. Now, in the Q&A pod, somebody says, is your crew unit if you're working in-house? Yeah, that's part of it, is by you're using your own in-house forces, and that's the labor and equipment part of that MILE acronym, the MILE acronym. So I like to use day size units because it makes the math simpler, actually. And so mobilization is a big issue. Um, you may have to mobilize different activities in different ways, but by mobilizing in advance, you can actually increase your productivity, but you do need to account for that mobilization. In this case, they were building the world's largest snow person, and they had to mobilize all that snow and store it in such a way that it didn't melt to become icy. Just the challenge of doing that alone is pretty impressive. Mobilization is something we're going to hear a lot about in the news with the current activity. So I like to use day size unit because it makes the math easy. Now, at the end of the day, we're trying to calculate cost per unit. Okay, cost per units can be linear, or cost per units could be an area activity, and that depends on the kind of work that we're doing. So if we're working on a roadway, some might say that that's a linear activity, much like a taxiway in this case is a linear activity. But actually, most road work itself is area based. Why is most road work area based? Linear activities more like ditches or guide rail or pavement markings. Why is most road work actually area based? Again, in the Q&A pod. Okay, I'll ask the question a different way. What's the narrowest road you have in your system? Yeah, there you go. Widths vary. If every road you had was exactly the same width, yeah, you could just do it by center line. But if your widths vary even a little bit, then you need to account for that variation. I mean, heck, just a 2-foot difference in the width of a standard 22-foot pavement is 10%. So that makes a big difference. So yeah, most of the time we do an area calculation. And the cool thing about that is if we do the area calculation on a 20-foot roadway, we can actually convert it to a 22-foot roadway very easily by just doing that area calculation. So it's one of the reasons I like to do an area calculation. You just need to pick your units, okay? And we'll do some examples of that. Now, in terms of the material, these are materials that are ones in your stockpiles. That M is not the materials that you get directly to the particular job. It's things you brought into your stockpile in your yard and you take back out, okay? Things you store on site. And they come in two types. There's divisible and item or indivisible items. We'll come back to that in a second. So give me some examples of divisible items. And you've heard of divisible permits. So you ought to be able to come up with some examples of things essentially you can't really count, but you can measure. Give me some items. Aggregate, rocks, sand. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. The most commonly we buy, gravel. Okay. This time of year, a real common item, salt, okay, stone or aggregate, okay. Items that we bring in quantity, we usually measure by the ton, by the cubic yard, by some other means. Okay, those are divisibles, and we can get divisible load permits if we're doing overloads on the state highway system, for instance. Versus stockpiled items, and yeah, the opposite would be indivisible, but really you think about it this way, a stockpiled item are things you actually count. Okay, so what kind of things do you have in your back of your yard right now that you could actually count? That you could go, I have 3 of these, 8 of those, things like that. Pipes, signpost, rails, yep. Precast culverts, yeah. Box culverts, catch basins, even your bolts, anything that you take an inventory of is something that would be stockpiled. So yeah, culverts, signs, rail, okay. Easy way to think about it is if you're going to haul it in a dump truck and dump it at the end of the process, it's probably divisible. If it's not, it's probably stockpiled. And the reason I want to know that is because for stockpiled items, I really want to keep track of everything. I don't want to lose, 20 feet of pipe. That's not good. But for divisible items, I have to account for loss because no matter what, you lose a little bit. You've all heard of Fort Knox. Part of the reason we built Fort Knox was the federal government found out every time they moved gold around, they lost a little bit of it. Now, we're talking very small amounts, but when it comes to gold, it's very expensive. So it was cheaper to actually build Fort Knox and other repositories than to keep trying to move them around to keep them safe. And same thing is true here. You're probably going to lose anywhere from 1 to 10% for your gravel, your salt, and your stone. And you have to account for that when you're doing your calculations. So keep that in mind. Now, invoices, the I in our acronym, invoices are things that go directly to the job. Okay, so what kind of things do you purchase where you get a ticket and you assign that directly to the job? So what kind of things do you get there? Asphalt. Yeah. Yep. Lots of, so far, a couple of people have put in asphalt. Absolutely. Asphalt is one. You buy it, you get a ticket, you pour it. Concrete's the same way. You're getting a ticket directly to that particular job. Okay. Emulsion, which is essentially asphalt mixed with water. Same concept. You get a ticket and you assign it to the job. Okay. But other things you can think about that you get invoices for that you might not sort of keep in your mind. But again, if you're getting an invoice, that's the I. So it could be equipment rental. Okay. Anything that you've got a contract for directly tied to a particular job project. Okay. And then something I want to make sure we don't forget about. What does FOB stand for? FOB, because there's FOB versus in place. What does FOB stand for? Let's see what people think. And it's not Friends of Bill. Sorry. Free on board. Yep. Freight on board. Yep. There's actually different definitions of FOB. Free on board and freight on board are both in the state spec in different places. I've seen it written down as official in other states. But the way I think about it is FOB means I went to pick it up at the plant. And so I have not got a complete cost yet. What I have to do is include the cost of shipping the item from the plant to the job site. Okay. So I have to account for the freight. So the F is either the freight, if you want to think of it that way, or you got it for free, but you got to still pay for the shipping. So if you're purchasing, say, porta potties for a job and you're getting them FOB, you may need to add a few $100s to get them to the job site, but you can move them around then versus having them delivered and picked up at the site. You have to make sure you compare apples to apples. So include the cost of freight. That's just something to keep in mind. Now, where do I get my invoice prices? There's tons of places out there. For estimation, for budget estimation, you don't have to go super crazy, okay? State bids are available through the OGS system. That's a possibility for you. You've got county bids that you could do and go with. You've got your local municipal bids. You could do piggybacking bids. There's really all kinds of possibilities that exist out there. So don't feel like it's really that hard. Heck, an estimate or quote is usually enough for costing at this time of year, getting ready to get into your contract system or planning whether you can afford to do it within your particular budget. Okay. The closer you get, the better off you're going to be. But the point is, go get yourself some prices. Where else could I go to get some prices? Any other ideas? Where else could I get my material and invoice prices for work? I could go to means pricing or Dodge reports. Yep, they're available. A lot of people subscribe to them. A lot of them are available on the web these days. They're very good sources available for prices, and for construction jobs, they're very, very accurate and they're very useful. So that's one good place to go to get your pricing. Yeah. The point is, there's plenty of estimates out there. If you can't find something, ask around, ask your neighbor. And the nice thing is, once you've set something up in the computer, you can always get more information, but make sure you're getting what you pay for. Okay. Okay. Make sure you're getting what you pay for. Now, in terms of material to invoice conversion, remember, at the end of the day, we're trying to get a cost per unit. Okay. That cost per unit could be linear or it could be area, but the key is you got to determine the production rate. So what you first have to do is determine the quantity needed for production. And remember, that's for an entire day. Okay. And then you convert that your dollars per unit. So you calculate the cost for the entire day in dollars. And then you know how much you get done in a particular day, say in square feet. And that's your cost per square foot. So that's really all you're going to have to do. And we'll do that with a couple of examples here before the end of the hour. Okay. But make sure you take your time and do this one well, and you know what your units are. Okay. That's very, very important. Here's a case where actually, when I look at this picture, I've shown this picture in a couple of other presentations. I actually figured it out. I don't know how close this bridge was to being overloaded, but if they'd actually put their axles in different places, they might have actually been okay. A classic example, they overloaded or they didn't convert properly. I don't know which, but it's an expensive repair, or it's the new house bridge. I'm not sure which. Now, the L and the E in our equation is our own labor and equipment. Okay, so when I say labor, I'm talking about your own crew. Okay, there's two reasons I like to keep my own labor and equipment separate. Why might I want to keep my own labor and equipment separate when I'm doing my cost calculations? Why might I want to calculate that separate? There's a couple of real good reasons that we do that. Well, I can give you one if you think about it pretty quickly, and that is, how's your budget set up? In a lot of cases, our labor and equipment are actually paid out of one account, but the actual work on the job is paid out of a different account. And so by keeping them separate, it's easier to track within your budget. But you have to include labor and equipment, because if you don't really know an apples to apples comparison. You don't really know what the total cost is. And I'll show you an example of that when we do some actual example practice stuff here in a little bit. But it's your own labor and your own equipment. The other reason you want to be able to do that is to be able to figure out whether you actually have the right balance. A lot of times we don't, and we know how hard it is to change, but it's important to understand what you've got and what you don't have for labor and equipment. Now, simple question for you. In this case, I'll actually ask you to raise your hand if you agree with this statement. If you agree with including your benefits for your own crew, raise your hand. I know if you're on the phone, you can't do that, but one person raised their hand. Two people. Okay. Everybody else is still hadn't had their second cup of coffee. I hope all of you will raise your hand. If you think about it, if you're really doing comparisons, apples to apples, you really do need to include the benefits. Otherwise, you don't really know what the comparisons are. I remember being in a meeting one time and an agency was bragging about how cheap it was for them to pave. And another time I had an agency who was talking about how cheap it was for them to put in curb, granite curb even. Oh no, actually it was concrete actually, now that I think about it. But in both cases, they didn't include their own labor and equipment. And when they did, they realized they really weren't that cheap. So you need to include your own labor and equipment, and you definitely need to include your benefits. So if anybody knows in the Q&A pod, what is your current benefit rate? So for every dollar you pay out in salary, what is your benefit rate you're paying in? Someone makes a good point in the Q&A pod about labor being paid for. I'll come back to that as soon as we answer the question on what your benefit rate is. 35%? I'd take that. That'd be pretty good. Anybody else got a benefit rate number that they know? This is a number you should know. You should learn that, even if it's budgeted separately, even if it's outside the highway budget, which it is in many cases, even though technically it shouldn't be. You really want to know that number. And we'll illustrate that with some real world examples here in the second half of our hour together. Benefit rates may be as high as 50 to 60% these days if you include health and retirement and insurance compensation. They can be pretty high. You really should know that number. And it's actually probably larger than you really want it to be. So keep that in mind. Now, someone raised the point, isn't labor and even equipment already paid for? Yes. It's something called the opportunity cost that you could get into. We could fight about the economics of it. Yes, it's paid for, but remember, if people are working on one project, they're not working on something else. And if you really want to know whether or not you should be doing it or going out to a contractor or trying to compare your cost versus someone else's, you need to include those costs. The neat thing about having your labor and equipment separate is it's real easy to budget and account for those things separately if you need to, because they are quote unquote paid for. But otherwise, you don't have a good cost comparison. You really don't know what the real cost is. And the first example we'll do, I'll illustrate that. So I won't forget you. I'll show you an example to show why. You definitely need to include your own labor and equipment, even if you don't budget it that way. Now, most of the time we're going to use average rates. For larger departments, that's pretty easy because you got 4 or 5 laborers, you got 8 or 9 medium equipment operators, and 6 HEOs or whatever. If you're a small agency and you've only got 4 or 5 people, use rounded rates. Take the rate and round it up to the closest dollar or half dollar. Don't get down to the penny. And go ahead and put the benefit number in there. And then that particular way, you might hide the fact because you really shouldn't be telling people salaries. That's not really fair to them. Now, for those of you who are highway officials, especially in the town and county side, that your line item might be in a different part of the budget. Do you include your own time? Yes or no? Do you include your own time when you're doing these calculations? Yeah, you should for the same reasons. Okay, again, you may need to budget them separately, but if you're trying to do apples to apples comparisons, you need to include your own time so you can really know what the real cost is. Just in the same way, a contractor is going to include the cost to the owner if the owner's out actually working on the job. If the owner's not, is in the office doing other things, that gets included in the overhead and things like that. Okay. And again, at the end of the day, we need to understand there's a cash flow issue that we have to deal with. Now, here's an honest gentleman who says needs cash for alcohol research. I don't think he's following the scientific method. I could be wrong there. And then equipment, again, this is your own equipment. You don't need to go crazy here. We're not trying to get down to the penny. You're just going to make a list of the equipment you've got or that you borrow on a regular basis. and then just come up with either a per hour or per mile cost. Most of the time we do per hour for equipment, and it's actually easier to calculate if you're using a day size unit for your calculations. Okay, and obviously you may need to include the cost of damage and insurance and things like that. That can be done, but most of the rates that are provided include some allowances for those costs. And where can you get those? There's lots of them out there. Okay, just to show you, everybody's heard of the Blue Book? New York State has a Blue Book, and in your handout there's a Blue Book. Well, every state's got one. Um, this is the one from Indiana. There's one for New York State. How do you find it? Go on the web, type in rental rate Blue Book and the state. In this case, New York, it'll pop right up. If you did it for Indiana, you'll get the one that says Indiana. If you did it for California, you get one for California. You can also go to something called Prime Media. It's a rental rate for the entire construction industry. That's a national publication. The point is, there's tons of them out there. Anybody else know of a way I could get rental rates? There's 2 other rental rates that I know of that are out there that people use a lot. What else could you go to get rental rates for your own equipment? Where could I go to get my rental rates if I don't know them? Again, back to Means and Dodge. Yep, that's one. And then the really good source, surprisingly, for rental rates is the FEMA. The emergency management folks actually have books for cost for recovering after a disaster. They actually have some pretty good lists. And the neat thing about their list is they've actually got some equipment that's not in some of the construction side because we use them for emergencies. So that's actually a pretty good place to go, is to go check out FEMA and EPA rates. Now, at the end of the day, when we do these calculations, we're never going to be that exact. So generally, we have to put a contingency in. I'm not talking about the general overhead rate. Okay, that's an overhead rate to pay for the people in the office, to pay for the lights, things like that's an overhead on top of your entire budget. I'm talking about the fact that there is that loss of material, or there is that rainy day. You want to get as close as you can, but then you're going to round up a little bit. You're going to have a contingency on top of it. Does anybody you have a particular contingency they use when they're doing project costing? You have an example of a contingency rate you like to use? 10%? Yeah. Yeah, that's not a bad number. The better you can get at that, the better off you're going to be. There are some people who actually like to say 25%. I think that's a bit much. It means we probably didn't do as good a job on actual calculation of what we were doing. But in the case of a larger network level, yeah, that may actually happen. I like 5 to 10. If you know your own system, you can get closer to 5. The more accurate you are, the better off you can be in terms of picking out the work you're going to get done. But better to have a little bit too much in your contingency than too little. Don't overload things. Okay. Otherwise, you could run short at the end of the year, and that's a tough job. The rate may depend on how rough the estimate might be. Yeah, absolutely. You may have variations in terms of how your estimates are working out. If you haven't done it in a while, maybe you have a slightly higher rate. If it's like chip seals that you do every year, you get that one down 4 or 5%. My last year or two when I was with Yates County, I was using a rate of 5%. I had real good numbers, and I was pretty good in terms of knowing exactly what the cost would be for the projects we did on a regular basis. And that's probably going to be true for all of you as well. Now, at the end of the day, you're going to calculate total cost for a particular project from the estimates that you generate. Okay? I want to talk about something called the 3-digit rule. Okay? Now, the 3-digit rule is around because people have become super reliant on computers. Now, this particular picture shows up on the internet. It's got a fake label on it. I hate to tell you, I did a little investigation on it. Someone tried to claim it's what a home computer will look like after around the year 2000. No, it's actually an exercise of just some equipment. I think it's a naval setup, actually. But it still does illustrate the point. We have become reliant on computers. Heck, we all have in our pockets or in our phones, we have cell phones, and those cell phones have computers that are pretty powerful. But they'll also calculate things out to the 100th digit. And can you really trust that? No, probably not. how many digits when you do a calculation can you really, well, that's why I'm saying it's actually a naval thing. The person put in there a computer with a steering wheel. Yeah, it's actually a naval setup. Uh, how many digits can you really believe in a calculation for budgets? Well, most of the time, that's why I like the 3-digit rule. You essentially take your digits and you round them, trusting the first 3 digits you come up with. Now, if you have a 1 at the beginning, remember you can include the 1. So, but generally 3 digits or less. And if you want to be sure you know how to do that, go find yourself an old slide rule and do the calculations for a while with a slide rule. I did that in college when I got an F because I had too many digits. And sure enough, it teaches you pretty quick to not carry extra digits you don't want to carry, and get real suspicious when somebody says something is going to cost $243,863.18. I don't think they're that accurate. You can account for it afterwards. You can go back and review it, but if they estimate at that level up front, they're probably relying too much on the calculator. Okay. So what's the process? Again, reminder, but here's how it works. We're going to write out the construction steps. We're going to estimate the time to complete in day size units. We're going to calculate the cost for each step. Okay. And then we're going to add the steps together. And that's what's also neat is if you're doing a job that's fairly complicated, you could actually steal from another estimate and just add those together. Most of the time for budget level, that's fine. But again, make sure you've got the proper steps and you've thought the whole process through from beginning to end. Okay. For instance, I don't think I want this driveway. Unless you've got a really interesting vehicle, you're going to have a hard time getting up into your garage. You know, if you're Tony Hawk the skateboarder, maybe you like this driveway, but most people, I don't think would really like to have this particular driveway. Okay. So that's the whole process. Now, before we get into a couple of examples, uh, yeah, holy cow. Yeah, good point. That is a crazy driveway. It's in the Atlanta area, and housing booms can drive people to buy some things they might not buy otherwise. Do you include works on traffic control? Yes or no? You're going to include works on traffic control in your calculations? Again, if you're trying to do apples to apples comparison, the answer would be yes. And a good way to think about it is this. If you were hiring a paving contractor or a chip seal contractor, and they were doing the whole job, they would include traffic control. If you really want to compare whether you're close in terms of price, you need to include traffic control. Neat thing about it is I can usually do traffic control as a separate operation and just add it back in because I've done a day size calculation. And then all I have to do is take my total cost for the day and divide it by the production rate, and I've got my cost per unit. It actually is pretty cool that way. Okay. Another reason we have to do that is a lot of times we put traffic control in a different budget area. So yes, normally we include that in our calculations. For the sake of argument today, we're not going to do that to save time because we've got about another 25 minutes together. But what I really want to do is I want to walk you through some examples. Okay. Now to do that, we're going to have a spreadsheet. Let me go pull the spreadsheet up here. There's a spreadsheet. It's available on our website. It's actually under our workshop on running your highway department. And you can download it. It's an Excel spreadsheet. If you have any issues with that, please let us know. Okay. If you go to our website and just search for running your highway department, it'll pop right up. And through the magic of, I forgot to ask Amanda and Adam, but I bet one of them can find that link for me. And they'll pop it into the chat pod here before the end of our hour. So you can download it directly. But it's an Excel spreadsheet that you can use, and it does a lot of the calculations for you. Okay, so I just want to show you what's involved here. It's 3 pages. And the neat thing is once you do it once, you can do it again for different projects. Okay, now I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. so that it's a little bit bigger, just so you can see. So it's got a place to put your municipality name, the project name, or in this case, project type, date it. If I had to pick the two things I always want people to put down on everything you put down is please put the date and put your name. Okay? Why do I want the date and the name on everything? Why is that actually pretty important? Why do I want the date and the name on everything? And while you're thinking about it, in the chat pod, Adam has put in the link directly to the web location for that spreadsheet. Why is that important? I really want to put my date and my name on it. So you can manage that information. If you come across an old estimate sitting in a drawer, yeah, you don't know inflation otherwise. Is it a 2-year-old estimate? Is it a 5-year-old estimate? Is it a 50-year-old estimate? I was listening to a thing this morning on my morning walk about John DeLorean. You probably remember him. He's famous cocaine car designer or whatever, the car for Back to the Future. Well, at one point he worked for the Pontiac division of General Motors, and he was making $60,000 a year. Today, $60,000 a year would be in the several $100,000 range. So you need to know the date. And you need to also know the name of who did it, because if you have a name, you might be able to go back to that person and say, hey, John, what did you mean when you wrote this down? So always put the date and always put the name down. We've set this up so it's got two parts in the spreadsheet. The upper part is where you do your initial calculations, your production for your particular job. And you could select by day or per hour if you prefer. You can actually put a per hour cost in there. Okay. You can do a calculation by area. You can do a linear calculation. And if you need to, because we do know it does happen, you have the ability to do a single item in each. Okay. So for instance, if you're doing a driveway pipe or cutting down a tree, you could actually put that in here. Okay. You can do the day length. Why is the day length important? Well, that's pretty easy. Most of you are probably working 8-hour days right now, but most of you probably are going to switch to 4-day weeks and 10-hour days in the summer. Your production rate will change. Okay. If you've got an area size unit, you need to know the length and the width of the particular roadway or particular item. Okay. If I change this to linear, you'll notice it hides the text. You just need the length at that point. Okay. So it actually does some of those things for you. So you don't have to calculate those out. Okay. The production costs come from the other pages, and we're going to walk through one of those here. The percent covered. Now that's a challenging one, but it's actually a pretty important one you can take advantage of. The percent covered allows you to do the calculation for a small project like a boxing an area out, but then it'll account for the fact that you're only fixing 5% of the roadway, so the overall unit price is lower. Because if you're only doing 5% of the roadway for a whole roadway later on you're budgeting, it's actually a smaller amount. That's all that is. It's the percentage covered. And this is explained. There's some help that comes with this as well. Okay. Now, all the calculations actually come from the 2 pages on materials and invoices and labor and equipment. The labor and equipment is your own labor and equipment. To save time, I threw in some numbers. The items in blue come from the first page, but everything else you put in, including your benefit rate, is 0 for a reason. We'll come back to that in a second. The cost of your crew, again, I rounded it in this case to the closest dollar. You could keep it to 50 cents. You could go exact. That's entirely up to you. And the same thing for the equipment. Okay. I took the overhead rates still to 0. We'll come back to that in a minute. But the type of equipment you've got in your fleet, and I rounded to the closest 50 cents. Once you put that in, you can save the spreadsheet again and again and again. So that's what's pretty cool about it. And then the materials and invoices, that's blank. You'll just put in the materials and the invoices for your particular activity. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to start with a fairly common operation. We're going to start with ditching. Okay, so if we're doing ditching, Okay, so we'll get my little whiteboard here. Okay, so I could write this on a piece of paper, and we'll see how my computer screen does here today. Okay, it's behaving okay. So I put in ditching. Okay, now, is this an area-based or a linear operation? What is ditching? What's my dollar per what unit? Okay. See if somebody can give me an answer on that. Most of the time it's linear. Okay, we calculate ditches in lineal feet. Okay. We know ditches do vary some in width, but because of the way we maintain them, okay, we treat that as a linear operation. Okay. So just to keep that in mind. So we'll come back over to my spreadsheet. We'll come back over to the first page. Okay, so we're going to make that a linear operation. Okay. So how many feet per day am I going to get done? How many feet? How many feet per day do you get done for ditching? Somebody put in 1,500. Okay. That's what's neat about this. You put in 1,500 and you've got that done. And by the way, it's interactive. We know that. So let's go look at our crew. Okay. So we'll look at our labor and equipment. So this is my labor and equipment, and I'm going to highlight and look at just the labor and equipment part here so y'all can read this. Okay. So I've got a highway superintendent, a 4-person, an HEO, an MEO, and a laborer. So who's on my crew? Am I on the crew? Is the highway official on this particular crew? Let's say not for this particular case. Okay. How many 4 people? Well, I hope you only need 1 person in charge. You've got probably a heavy equipment operator. So you need 1 heavy equipment operator for the day. Maybe you need 2 trucks or 3 trucks. If I borrowed trucks from another municipality, how do I account for that? Let's say I wanted 4 trucks, but because of the way I do my work. How would I account for that? Do I put in 2 here because that's all I've got from my own crew, or do I put in 4 because I borrowed 2 from somebody else? What do you think? Just your own. And there's some arguments that can be made for that. But if you are trading with somebody else and later on your 2 trucks are going to their municipality so they can do some work, I usually like to put in the total including what I'm borrowing, because later on your crews are going to be somewhere else and they're not available to you. And so you have to account for that fact, because that's the real cost if you think about it. Now, your budgetary cost could be smaller. If you wanted to, you could actually come in here and say that I'm going to borrow these. Okay. And you would put in the same rates because your actual cost to your own crew, but you could do it that way. You could put in your borrowed, so you could track those separately if you really wanted to. But you do need to account for the fact that you're borrowing somebody else's equipment. And then you might have 1 or 2 people in terms of labor. I'll put in 1 because that's usually the most you'll see. And I'm purposely not including traffic control. Okay, just for the sake of, because of our time constraint, I'm not including traffic control. Okay, but I would add that in the actual situation at the end of the day. Now, in terms of trucks, well, if I've got 4 trucks, I need to use 4 trucks. And again, I'm using my own equipment, my own pricing. 4 trucks. Do I need a loader? In this case, no, but I do need an excavator. Okay. I need at least 1 or 2 pickups. I'll say I can get away with 1 for this particular job, and I don't need much else. Okay. So that's pretty much it in the way of labor and equipment. And as you can see, the cost comes up, it calculates it out. You could do that calculation. Okay. You get your equipment cost. Okay. It's pretty cool. So now let's go over to materials and invoices before we go back to the first page. And I'm going to blow this up here again so you can see it. Okay. So what materials do I have for ditching? What materials? What do I pull out of stock? Is there anything I got to pull out of stockpile for doing ditching operations? What have I got to pull if I'm done ditching? Little grass seed, erosion protection, okay? Maybe a blanket, okay? Let's just assume some grass seed. Let's just assume, a lot of times if I could just put in some grass seed, that'd be enough. That'd be all I'd have to do, okay? So I just put a little grass seed down. What is the price of grass seed? Anybody know? Again, these are the kind of things you would calculate it out. Going on the web and just looking, it's about $4 for a 5-pound bag. I know that's not a very good price. Oops, that's pounds. And if I'm going to do 1,000 feet of ditching, maybe I need about 100 pounds. Okay. Okay, so that's about $400 of grass for the whole day. I could probably get it if I buy it in quantity a lot cheaper, probably closer to about $1.50 if I buy a big barrel of it. But I might want to account for the fact that I lose a little whippage and stuff like that. So maybe I actually wind up estimating at about 120. Okay, so let's go back to our totals. So look at this. If I look at my total for ditching, most of the cost for ditching is our own labor and equipment. Okay, if you scroll down, it actually calculates the unit cost down here near the bottom. And I'll scroll up so you can see it. So it's about $2.50 per linear foot. Okay. But that's mostly labor and equipment. If I didn't account for my own labor and equipment, and I'm just temporarily going to delete those, the cost per linear foot gets almost nothing because it's our own labor and equipment that really drives the cost of ditching. And that's true for other things you'll actually find, but I like to start with ditching because of that. It reminds us how important it is to account for our own labor and equipment. What's cool about this, as soon as I've done these calculations, I can do a different project, okay? So if I've got a different project and I want to give myself a little bit of extra safe, so let's assume a small contingency of about 10%, okay? And instead of a 1,500 foot stretch of ditch, maybe I want to do 5,000 feet. So I just type in 5,000 feet and it tells me the total cost. And that's what's neat about this is once I've set the spreadsheet up, I can go in and do other projects in almost an instant, okay? I can also see what the effects are if I increase my productivity by maybe scraping a little bit less and doubling my amount of work I get done. The total cost for the day is the same, but my production rate goes up, my cost per foot goes down. And it's actually a pretty cool operation to do. Now we're going to do one more example before the top of the hour, but I don't want to forget something. Remember the cost, 3,840, or I'm going to purposely round my number here a little bit. I want to get my price to about $1.50 per square foot. Okay, so I'm going to make it about 2,800. That's a pretty good guess. Okay, so about $1.50 per linear foot. But remember, I didn't include my benefits and I didn't include any overhead for my equipment, the cost of storage and things like that. What kind of overhead rate do I need to pay for the barn and the lights and the heat? What number do you think I need for overhead rate if it didn't have it in it already? If I didn't have it in already. It varies. And that's something you need to be aware of. If you're using equipment rates, make sure you know whether they include the overhead rate or not. The ones from the the Blue Book and from FEMA include an overhead rate. They're built in. But if they're not built in, that range could be anywhere from 10 to 50%. So make sure you know what the overhead rate is. And if you need to include it. If you're using means or dodge, a lot of times they don't include it. You can actually adjust that. But the benefit rate's the bigger one. Earlier, I think Roger put in 35%. I'm going to put in 35% is my benefit rate. And then I'm going to come back and look at the total. Okay. Look what happens. My labor and equipment jumped the cost per linear foot up to $1.64. Okay. Again, I'm keeping it 3 digits. I'm rounding a little bit. Rounding up, by the way, every time. There's an extra cost involved. Okay. By just doing that one activity of changing the benefit rate, I changed the price per foot. I changed the overall price. So again, know your benefit rate, put the proper number in. If that jumped to 50%, it's up another dime per foot. Okay. So keep that in mind. We need to really do that. Now, the other one I want to do, and I've got about 5 minutes. That's perfect. Let's come up and bring up my chip seal one here. So I've already done a chip seal operation. Okay. And again, date, name, all that fun stuff, you put that in there. The first time I did was in 2017. So my numbers are out of date by a few years. So I might need to account for inflation if I was going to use this now. And I've got plenty of room to put notes like that. But I did all my calculations up. I've got my labor and my equipment. Again, in this case, I was assuming 6 trucks, not all my own. Okay. I've got the equipment, the overhead, things like that. Materials and invoices. I've got my stone. I've got my emulsion. I've got my chipper. I've got my roller. I put all that information in to my spreadsheet. Okay. What's neat about this process is by setting this all up, I can then come back in here and see what happens if I increase my productivity and do some what if games. So right now, if you look, my production rate is about 3 miles. Okay. In fact, it actually calculates to 3 miles, and I'll blow that up a little bit so you can see. Hang on. Okay. The actual formula is 3 times 5,280, which is 3 miles. Okay. So while the units are feet, and we're using feet just to be consistent, you can pick your favorite unit. Okay. You could type a different unit in here. Just, I prefer to keep it simple. Go back to base units of feet. Okay. You could go metric if you really wanted to. But what happens if I go and all I do is increase my productivity by adding additional trucks? I don't change the amounts of anything except I have more trucks and I get more done. So I got to pay for more stone and pay for more emulsion, but everything else stays the same. Okay, so my project is $50,000, about 0.18 dollars per square foot. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump that to 6 miles. I'm only doing 6 because I can do the math in my head. Okay, so everything else stays the same, 6 miles. I come over to my labor and equipment. Nothing changes there. Same crew, except that I got to bring in some more trucks. I got to borrow 6 trucks from my neighbor. Okay, so that number jumps to 12. And the number of trucks jumps to 12. I then come over to my materials and invoices. My production, I need twice as much stone. Okay, so I just take 420 times 2, which is 840. Okay, and I need twice as much emulsion. Chipper and roller are the same. Okay, now since I've already done this as a calculation, all I have to do is multiply times 2. And then I come back over to my totals page, and you'll notice my price per square foot has gone down by, only about a penny or 2 per square foot. But remember, over the course of the day, if we're doing 6 miles, that's 500,000 square feet. That adds up to quite a difference in terms of total price. My production goes up, my cost per square foot go down, and then I can use that for other projects. So I did this initially for a road that was only 18 feet wide. If I go to a 24-foot wide roadway, I've already got the calculations there. And that's the reason we like to set things up in a spreadsheet and walk through the whole operations. And remember, you can do this. Okay, good question. You could do this for any project you want. You could do it for chip seals. You could do it for paving. You could do it for culverts. And Mark raises a good point. Your day unit might need to change. Okay. I did my calculations based upon a 10-hour day, but maybe you need to do an 8-hour day. Yes, that's a possibility. Each agency needs to figure that out. When are you doing that? If you're doing your chip seals in the summer, 10-hour days, you could probably leave it. However, what decides if you want to go 5 days a week? You may need to account for the fact you're now paying some overhead or overtime, on that Friday. So that's why you got to mark all the steps, write everything down, and think about things like the day length, overhead rates, benefit rates, the whole process. Okay. Now, in 1 hour, we can't cover everything, but I hope this gives you some insights and helps you out. You don't have to do this in a spreadsheet. You can do it by hand. Okay. Whatever helps you calculate things out is what you need to do. Now, if you have any questions on any of this stuff that we've covered in the hour, send me an email. There's my email address. You can go to our website, NYSLTAP.CALS.cornell.edu is the website base that you can go to. We're actually updating that. We'll be getting you more details on that soon. And then if you're interested, we'll have more Topical Tuesday webinars. We're taking next week off because of the county highway officials, but we are doing one on winter maintenance, plowing and stuff on the last day of the month. We've actually put in for the next 5 till we get our workshops this spring. That'll be released next Monday. But if you're interested in more details on the costing, we do have the Running Your Highway Department workshop being held this spring. The virtual portion will be held on March 18th for a couple of hours, and then there'll be a face-to-face in Livingston County. But if you're interested and you're not near Livingston County, we can bring that workshop to you, but you need to get hold of us and talk to us, and we'll have to make the arrangements with COVID. The details on that we have to work out. Okay, with that, I thank you. I hope that answered some of your questions. I'll stick around if you have any. If you want to put them in the Q&A pod, please feel free. I'll try to answer as many of them as I can. If they stop coming in, I'm going to call it a day. We'll shut down. But other than that, have a safe day. And thanks for joining us. And we'll hang on here for just a few seconds to see if you have any questions. Okay, Mark. Thank you. Okay. Okay, Adam and Amanda, I think we don't have any more questions coming in.